All right, let's get started here. Welcome to our Saturday morning session. I'm David Cory. I'm faculty here in philosophy. I was originally not supposed to be the chair of the session. My dear wife, Therese, who's also faculty in philosophy, was supposed to chair the session, and she is really under the weather, so I'm going to run off after her and go make her soup. But that's a kind of poetic knowledge in itself. It's the craft of making. Our panel today is about deepening the wells, sacramentality, and imagination. And we have three great speakers today. And the first is Dwight Lindley from Hillsdale College. Dwight holds the Barbara Longway Briggs Chair in English Literature at Hillsdale, where he teaches in the English department. He regularly teaches courses in great books in modern British literature and has published essays on Dickens, Hopkins, Woolf, Newman, Austen, George Eliot, and literary theory. He is working on a book presenting a theological phenomenology of the literary act. And his talk today will be Romanticism, a Protestant gift to the Catholic imagination. So let's welcome Dwight.
Good morning. I'll try not to be distracted by this other lecture on the computer right beside me. If I accidentally start reading a paper about Remy Bragg, then you'll know why. Thank you. I was not being sarcastic in order to. There was not an indirect, communication. Anyway. Okay, Romanticism as a Protestant gift to the Catholic imagination. Today I want to advance a thesis in 5 steps. First, that Romanticism was originally a Protestant phenomenon. Second, that the early Romantics were reaching out for goods historically associated with Catholicism. Third, that they tended to push their theory and practice of these goods beyond what Catholics were then comfortable with. Fourth, that their radicalism has subsequently blessed Catholic thought and practice. And fifth, that this dynamic has something to teach us about the development of doctrine and the development of Catholic tradition in general. The heart of my argument is that Romanticism should be seen as a Protestant gift to the Catholic imagination. And thinking through why that is the case will improve our self-understanding as Catholics. The first step, though, is simply to admit that Romanticism's earliest development as a movement, in Germany and England especially, took place in Protestant milieus. Undeniably, Romanticism, which began in Germany and England in the late 1790s, quickly spread to become an international movement across Europe. And I know that its beginnings were, could be considered before the 1790s. These are all subject to many scholarly disputes and interventions. There are all kinds of proto-romanticisms and things that feed in, but I still think there's something real we're talking about when we're talking about Germany in 1790s and England in 1790s. So I'm just going to leave that for the footnotes. It's quickly spread to an international movement across Europe. It would go on to mark the literature, art, and culture, but also the science, politics, educational theory, and so on, of France, Italy, Poland, Russia, and other less Protestant countries. But these later waves rolled out in the 18-teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, while the earliest organized beginnings of the movement in the German university town of Jena on the one hand and the British Lake Country on the other arose in distinctly Protestant cultures. On the German side, the brothers August Wilhelm and Friedrich Schlegel were the sons of a Lutheran pastor, and the poet Friedrich Hölderlin was intended from youth for the Lutheran ministry as well. The Schlegel's close associate, Friedrich von Hardenberg, aka Novalis, was raised in the pietist tradition of the Moravian Brethren, and all the rest of the major German Romantics, actually this is not quite true. The vast majority of the German Romantics were also raised Protestant. So the footnotes, there's a couple of Catholics in that mix. On the English side, Both Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, along with William's sister Dorothy, were raised Anglican, while the slightly older William Blake was raised Low Church dissenter, probably also in the tradition of the Moravian Brethren, interestingly. And the same could be said of the rest of the early English Romantics, down to Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Though most Romantics in Germany and England, and all I have just mentioned, grew alienated from the faiths of their upbringing, it marked them nevertheless. Early Romanticism was decidedly Protestant. And I'd be happy to go into all of the exceptions to that claim in the Q&A if you want. The second claim I now want to make is that Romanticism's early adherents were especially interested in ideas that had been more associated with Catholicism, and especially medieval Catholicism. To understand their approach, though, we need to see clearly the central governing idea of early Romanticism, the encounter with the infinite in the finite through poetry. It was Wordsworth who wrote that in moments of poetic sight, quote, our noisy years seem moments in the being of the eternal silence. And, quote, our landlocked souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither. Moments open out onto eternity. Mortal land touches immortal sea when a person reaches out with the right creative vision, thought Wordsworth. Novalis said it very clearly in 1798. Die Welt muss romantisiert werden. The world must be made romantic, must be romanticized. And one can do this by, quote, endowing the commonplace with a higher meaning, the ordinary with mysterious respect, the known with the dignity of the unknown, the finite with the appearance of the infinite, close quote. When I do this, I am making it romantic. Such romanticizing, they thought, would happen through poetry, but what does that mean? Here is where their interest in Catholic ideas comes in. The Romantics, both in Germany and in England, thought of poetry not simply as writing or seeing, but as a whole creative way of life. And they described this way of life in what will sound to us like Catholicizing terms. Broadly, the Romantics were drawn to the idea of a sacramental cosmos, a heavens and an earth that mediate the divine to human beings, and this meant a different way of reading the world. They sought to approach the book of nature and all history, as some of the church fathers and many medieval doctors had, figurally. As Novalis put it, quote, everything we experience is a communication. Thus, the world is indeed a communication, a revelation of the Spirit. But the present enlightened age, he thought, had forgotten how to read for spiritual meaning. Quote, the age has passed when the Spirit of God could be understood. The meaning of the world is lost. We have stopped at the letter, close quote. So, spirit and letter. We're seeing the letter in the modern world, but we're not reading the Spirit. We need to read for the Spirit. The present enlightened age, he thought, had forgotten how to read for spiritual meaning. The age has passed when the Spirit of God could be understood, he said. The meaning of I already said this, excuse me, forgive me. History, seen this way, is a revelation of spiritual meaning, or Geist, which is why Friedrich Schlegel could say that the historian is a prophet facing backwards, which is a pretty cool way to talk about historians. To respond creatively and romanticize the world is, from one point of view, to read it spiritually. Changing the metaphor, they also sought to see the romantic vocation in priestly and Eucharistic terms. We are called, they thought, to receive the world as gift and offer it back up as priests. For as Novalis said, ordinary life, life of everybody, is a priestly service, wherein every reality we embrace is, quote, something similar to the Eucharist, a finite place where we meet an infinite presence. Quote, eating is only accentuated living, he said, meaning that all living is a kind of eating, a reception of the world in both its natural and supernatural reality. Quote, all spiritual partaking can be expressed by eating. All experience, then, is in some sense Eucharistic, and it should be stressed that this was a highly peculiar thing to say in late 18th century Protestant Germany. The same could be said of the Romantics' appeal to a sacramental vision of marriage, which was Catholic doctrine, but either rejected or contested by most Protestant communions, with some asterisks and exceptions there too. In general, both German and English Romantics portrayed human-to-human marriage as a site of transcendent encounter with the divine, and thus it lies at the heart of the three major novels by Friedrich Schlegel, Novalis, and Friedrich Hölderlin. Each features a marriage plot with a young man pursuing a young woman, but the distinctively romantic twist is that each conjugal relationship opens out onto a relationship with the whole world. That is, we are in a kind of marital relation, erotic and procreative, with the whole world of our experience. This colors one's view of writing, as Schlegel indicated in one of his spicier fragments. Publishing, he wrote, is to thinking, as the maternity ward is to the first kiss. Just think about that. In England, Wordsworth wrote of something similar in a poetic fragment, describing the relationship between the world and human thought as a kind of marriage. Quote, "The discerning intellect of man, when wedded to this goodly universe in love and holy passion, participates in the renewal of the world by seeing it in God." For the Romantics, the sacrament of marriage, like the sacrament of the Eucharist, presented a compelling way to understand their poetic vocation. Of the many other Catholicizing elements in Romanticism, their fascination with Dante, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and all things Gothic and medieval. I know this is the beginning of, Gothic revival, all kinds of neo-medievalism. In addition to those, the turn to fairy tales also bears mentioning, as it marks one more significant way in which they understood the poetic vocation and the pursuit of the infinite in the finite. Of course, fairy tales are no object of Catholic doctrine, though they were broadly associated with medieval Catholic culture. Notably, many of the Romantics told and retold fairy tales on principle, for they believed certain truths could be seen more easily this way. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, for example, wrote that quote, his early reading of fairy tales and genii, et cetera, had habituated his mind to the vast. The vast is a noun there. To realities that exceed the data of the senses. Should children be permitted, he asked, to read romances and relations of giants and magicians and genii? I know all that has been said against it, but I have formed my faith in the affirmative. I know no other way of giving the mind a love of the great and the whole. Those who have been led to the same truth step by step through the constant testimony of their senses seem to me to want a sense which I possess. They contemplate nothing but parts, and all parts are necessarily little, and the universe to them is but a mass of little things. Close quote. Here, the fairy tales do the work of contextualizing the world's parts, setting them within a vast whole, only mysteriously grasped, the sensuous within the numinous. The German Novalis put this even more clearly and intriguingly. Quote, "It is only because of the weakness of our organs," he said, "and of our contact with ourselves, that we do not discover ourselves to be in a fairy world. All fairy tales are only dreams of that familiar world of home, which is everywhere and nowhere. The higher powers in us, which one day will carry out our will like genies, are now muses that refresh us with sweet memories along this arduous path." Close quote. For Novalis, that is, the world communicated by fairy tales just is the real world. Full stop. It is the world of infinite spirit, everywhere pulsing through finite sense experience, and childlike fairy tale narratives are some of our best ways of taking it seriously. To romanticize the world, then, is also to narrate the world as fairy tale. Now, for the third step in my thesis, I want to argue that in each of its Catholic borrowings, Romanticism tended to radicalize the ideas it was interested in. Sacramentality, priesthood, marriage, and fairy tales, for instance. In other words, the Romantic versions of these doctrines generally pushed beyond what contemporary Catholics were comfortable with. Begin with the notion of sacramentality in general. The Romantics were interested, as I have said, in a revelatory cosmos, so that Friedrich Schlegel could say, quote, "For the perfect Christian, everything would really have to be a mediator." Everything. And he adds provocatively that in this, the heterodox Jewish philosopher Spinoza may be closer to the truth than many professing Christians. For Catholics of that time, Schlegel's radically mediatory cosmos was not inconceivable, right? There are roots of this, of course, and you can find some similar ideas in some of the fathers and things. Not inconceivable, but it was uncomfortable. The seven sacraments were the royal road of God's grace, and the threat of pantheism was enough to make one wary of making everything a mediator. And likewise, it was uncomfortable for Catholics to imagine everyone as in principle a kind of priest. Again, it was Schlegel who put it most provocatively. Quote, "Let imagine take over and you will have a God." Quite right, for the imagination is man's faculty for perceiving divinity. It is the imaginer who learns to perceive the eternal in the temporal, the spirit in the matter, and everyone who does so is a priest. Quote, "The priest as such exists only in the invisible world. His only purpose on earth will be to transform the finite into the infinite. Hence, he must be and continue to be, no matter what the name of his profession, an artist." That is to say, to be an artist is to be a priest, and vice versa. But what Catholic would like to say this? In their hunger for a fresh religious encounter with God in and through the world, the Romantics were willing to push the doctrine beyond the usual formations. The same was true in their presentation of marriage and fairy tales. Sacramental marriage as a natural source of supernatural grace was one thing. But as I have already indicated, many Romantics went much further, extending our marital relations to include the whole world. An open marriage, as you might say. The English poet Percy Shelley put it clearly when he defined love as, quote, "a universal thirst for a communion not merely of the senses, but of our whole nature, intellectual, imaginative, and sensitive. In all aspects of life," he said, "our love for things leads us to desire communion with the world, and, quote, "the sexual impulse serves from its obvious and external nature as a kind of type or expression of the rest," close quote. All our relations with the world are driven by love, and all love is in some sense sexual. This was a few steps beyond Catholic teaching. And in the case of Romantic teaching about fairy tales, again, there is a push beyond what is comfortable. Novalis said that the fairy world is all around us, but he went further. Not only must we believe in magical beings beyond us, we must learn to see our own poetic and spiritual lives as in some sense magical. Every spiritual touch, he said, is like the touch of a magic wand, which is to say that our experience of the infinite world of spirit gives us not just ideas, but a kind of magical idealism, as he said. But do we have to be magical idealists to be awake to the world? These were, and perhaps still are, challenging suggestions to Catholics. Now, I'm running out of time. My fourth step in the argument is basically to argue that these kind of pushy ideas which radicalize certain Catholic notions in Romanticism nevertheless influenced Catholicism for the positive. Some of the examples I give are the little way of St. Therese, for whom every moment, every smallest experience is a site of divine encounter, right? She has this kind of radical sacramental view of the whole cosmos, meeting God in every little thing. And then I also talk about Hopkins, whose poetry dramatizes a kind of priestliness in the world, right? Not just his priesthood at the altar, but his priesthood in the encounter with every living thing. You know, you can think of any Hopkins poem is about this. He receives the world, he thanks God for it, he offers it up with his own addition, which is seeing the infinite God in it. That is a Hopkins poem. And then I go on to some examples of John Henry Newman, the way that he received Romanticism in his development theory, and Johann Adam Müller in Germany. I'm just going to skip to my last paragraph, though. You can ask about that later if you want. Oh, Tolkien. I also talk about Tolkien. Finally, I want to suggest that this whole state of affairs, Romanticism's Protestant origins, its Catholic borrowings, its radicalizing tendency, and the blessing it bestowed on subsequent Catholic thought, presents an important lesson for us to think about today. Why did the Romantics push their theories of sacramentality, priesthood, marriage, the rest so far? Because they were hungry for meaning and hungry for something to live for. We seek the absolute everywhere, wrote Novalis, and only ever find things. Striving to find a transcendent God in an enlightened world of matter and motion, they pushed more desperately for sacramental connection than Catholics at the time. But as they did so, God responded to their prayer, giving them something precious. Indeed, as we know, the Lord hears the cry of the poor and does not abandon them. For us who are Catholics, here is a fresh reason to get off our triumphalist high horses and to the peripheries, as Pope Francis would say, appreciating the gifts God has given to the least of these. It is easy to sit comfortably and figure that we have everything we need, but as Remy Brague and others have argued, this is a hat tip to the next talk, this has never been true of the Church. She is at her best when she humbles herself, finding sources of fresh life beyond her borders. And so we could do worse than to take the advice of that neo-romantic poet Dana Gioia when he said, and this is my last, this is just a little poem from Gioia called Entrance. Whoever you are, step out of doors tonight, out of the room that lets you feel secure. Infinity is open to your sight, whoever you are. With eyes that have forgotten how to see, from viewing things already too well known, lift up into the dark a huge black tree and put it in the heavens, tall, alone. And you have made the world and all you see. It ripens like the words still in your mouth. And when at last you comprehend its truth, then close your eyes and gently set it free. Thank you.
We have just under 3 minutes for questions, if you'd like. Yeah, you can field your own if you unless you want me to.
Yes, sir. They're in the back with the yellow tie.
Hey, Dwight. So to take what you just said about Romanticism and its compatibility with Catholicism kind of to the next step of literary history, I've just finished teaching James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, and I'm wondering, so much of what you called in your public discourse piece dark Romanticism, right, is tremendously influential among the modernists. Do you think the tragedy of modernism, I'm thinking of Stephen Dedalus really in particular, is this failure to see the compatibility, right? Stephen Dedalus wants to be a priest transmuting the bread of his everyday experience, but he doesn't see that as something that actually is compatible with his Catholic religion.
Yes, I mean, it is tragic because, well, there's a whole story here about dark Romanticism, which my basic thesis is, as you're suggesting, that it strips a whole set of romantic kind of doctrines about what poiesis is and strips them of the kind of metaphysical framework and spiritual revealed framework in which they make sense. Then you're just left with an imposition of a kind of brute poetic force on the world. And you have Stephen Dedalus and his darker imaginings. I don't know. I tend to read that book as revealing his own failings, though, actually, as a poet, and thus actually pointing a little bit hopefully towards like opening up to the question, how can this actually be possible? Right? Stephen hasn't found it. So I at least read that book as a little more hopeful than Stephen himself. But yes, it's tragic. His story's that far. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, are we out of time?
No, we have one quick question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I was wondering, sorry, Naomi Fisher, I was wondering what's new and what's old here, because, a lot of the things that you talked about could be found in earlier source material, like, okay, God's got that, for example. things. It's something insofar as it exists in the manifestation of God. We can look at like Diotima's ladder for like, marriage and
No, and the whole
reproductive
patristic Platonic tradition.
Yeah, so all of those things. But what seems to me to be novel here is like in response to Enlightenment kind of skepticism, there are new ways of seeing, and poetry is like a distinctive way of seeing, or I don't know, activates a distinctive way of seeing that gives access to these things. And so this notion of imagination, I think, maybe is the real new thing that comes about after this time as a way of sort of reintroducing these, like you said, Platonic.
Agreed.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think it's a kind of the imagination as this kind of procreative response to the world, which makes it more than what it was. Meeting God in like the phenomena, all the phenomena of the world, responding with our own gift, marrying ourselves to it imaginatively, as you said, making it more than what it was. Yeah, I think that's kind of the heart of the new. Thank you.
Goes beyond Nicosia in Plato, you know. Yeah,
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm sure, Dwight, we'll have more time to discuss after our session. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Laura Dugan is our next speaker, and she's an artist and a professor living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. As a lifelong artist, Laurel makes imagination and the development of ideas the main focus in her life. And in addition to painting, she enjoys studying art theory. Laurel holds an MFA in painting and an MA in visual critical studies from Kendall College of Art and Design. And her MA thesis, From Self-Portraits to Selfies, studied gender performance in female self-portraiture over the last 400 years. She is a recipient of an Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation grant. And let's welcome Laurel.
Hi. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? This doesn't seem like it's, yeah. Okay. I just discovered a glitch in my presenting plans, so sorry if I, so if I find myself on a wrong screen, I'm so sorry. Okay. So thanks for coming. The title of my talk is Saints, Serrano, and Phenomenology. So there's a common belief that contemporary art is incomprehensible and sometimes even unsavory. So I engage it. In this talk, I'll rely primarily on Remy Bragg's concept of secondarity to illustrate how contemporary art fits into the greater lineage of art history. I'll also lean on philosophers Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gisson for their scholarly reflections on art and a few other observations from artists themselves. And right at the beginning here, I just want to make clear that contemporary, in the way that I use it, means art made since 1945. And then also, I'm going to show a lot of images that I won't have time to talk about, but I would love to talk about them. So if you have questions or you want to catch me afterward, that'd be awesome. Okay. So, okay, sorry, I already made a mistake. This was what was supposed to be up while I was saying that. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Remy Bragg's concept of secondarity allows us to I'm so sorry. One sec. Maybe I wasn't. Okay. No, this was right. All right. So why engage contemporary art? Art can be the site and occasion for a transcendent experience, and that in itself is good. But the experience of contemporary art is unique in the larger body of art history because it is an experience of another soul mediated through visual language with whom you share this era. The way history tells the story of civilizations, art tells the story of souls. Art being made now tells the story of embodied souls of the present, and it creates new streams in an existing dialogue and invites us to join. Remy Bragg's concept of secondarity allows us to understand contemporary art as an expression of our time and place in continuity with the past. Secondarity is the concept of receiving the heritage of a previous culture as a gift to be preserved and passed on. While Bragg's work specifically examines how the Romans inherited cultural gifts from Greece and Jerusalem, the idea easily translates to the way contemporary art has inherited the patrimony of art history. Today's artists, soaked in the tradition of their forebears, make works that carry the provision of history, but they are marked with the concerns of life now. Like artists of any time, they respond to their specific time and place and circumstance through subject, style, materials, and process. Like the Romans, artists cannot transmit anything without translating it through their own experience. It is not possible to be a carbon copy of a previous time and place, and that is why Roman culture is called Roman and not the Greek and Jewish culture of the Apennine Peninsula. So the Romans passed on the cultural gifts of Greece and Jerusalem, but inevitably with a Roman identity imprinted on it. Even works that consciously defy the past, such as Duchamp's Ready-Mades and Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning, still depend on the past and exist within a lineage that passes it on. So I want to give you 3 principles to begin to engage contemporary art. They are openness, phenomenological engagement or contemplation, and empathy. So first, openness. We have to be open to the idea that contemporary can be good and worth engaging. And once a person is open, then there's room for the magic to happen. Number 2, phenomenological engagement. Aesthetic experience takes time, and there's no way around it. And our attention is a limited, ever more precious commodity. Art will not fight for your attention. You have to freely give it, and only then will it begin to reveal itself to you. Through continual openness and exposure to artworks and information, one's capacity for engagement increases. Putting the artwork in dialogue with our lived experiences and connecting it to Christian tradition can give way to a sublime experience. The experience of this poetic knowledge, or truth you know but cannot fully explain, is its own reward. And if I can go there. The third principle is empathy. Empathy is the glue underpinning this whole encounter. Empathy is the human connection through and because of transcendent experience. Martin writes that through art, one enters the domain of the spirit. He goes on to say humans can only truly communicate with each other by coming into contact with the metaphysical. He asserts that allowing the transcendental to touch us creates the possibility for connection. Similarly, writer Catherine Ricketts shows how mirror neurons create a biological empathy. She writes, "While I watch dancers practice, mirror neurons in my premotor cortex stimulate my motor system, and my brain instinctively mimics their movements. The mirror system also helps me to feel the emotions I sense others feeling, as if they were my own. My body practices mimicry, and my heart learns empathy. Not only can a work of dance or sculpture draw my awareness to my own body, it can bring me momentarily into the experience of another. Art opens my eyes. It is a mercy against self-centeredness. It draws my attention to my own body, and it draws me out of my body, as if into the bodies of others." So, let's apply these principles to a few specific works. There are like 2 main categories of I would say, contemporary art. Art that puzzles and art that shocks. And art that puzzles further subdivides into what we commonly call abstract and then new forms. And I think often a name that's associated with abstraction and confusion is Jackson Pollock. So here we're looking at Pollock's Autumn Rhythms from 1950. I want to show you how this gestural, seemingly non-objective work fits into the larger picture of art history. So, as you can see, the all-overness of the composition, where there's no clear hierarchy, has literally been around since the cavemen. And you can see the lovely gestural marks from the close-up of this view at Lascaux. Fast forwarding several thousand years, in the top right corner, you can see the all-overness of this Roman mosaic. And then in the other two images, the later Byzantine works emphasize flat shapes and stylized figurative elements. Here we're looking at a few of Pollock's early works. The earliest is in the top left, and then the bottom left, and then in 1946, we get this, again, very all over, no clear hierarchy, very gestural work. And you can see his progression here, and this is, 1946 is right before he begins what we consider his mature work. So now returning to Autumn Rhythm, we can see how Pollock emptied the composition of persuasive content, but kept the armature of abstraction. And like a jazz musician improvises with notes, he improvised with paint. While gestural and fluid, this is a very intentionally composed composition. This painting, for reference, is 17 feet long and nearly 9 feet high. The large scale of the work affects the viewer's biological response in person, activating the mirror neurons. And the resulting physical empathy can spark the viewer's imagination. And I really think it's in this fertile space between the artwork and the viewer as the mirroring takes place that meaning is made. Because of the work's open-ended nature, there are greater possibilities for multifaceted meaning than what prescribed imagery holds. Sorry, this is all over. Pollock may have redefined painting, but he did so from the inside with a strong understanding of art history. He accepted the gifts he received in content and technique, and he carried them forward with his imprint on them. So both of these paintings were also made in 1950. On the left, there's Willem de Kooning's Excavation, and on the right, William Congdon's Winter Morning. Willem de Kooning went on to become one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. William Congdon had a religious conversion to Catholicism and spent most of the second half of his life in Europe. He continued to paint in an abstract expressionist idiom for the rest of his life, but he is probably most well known for applying the tenets of abstract expressionism to religious imagery. Here we're looking at Croce Fisso number 9 of Congdon's, and you can see the flat shapes of iconography and abstract expressionism combine with gestural smears and nearly violent palette knife scraping to create an image at once abstract and powerfully figurative. Even in reproduction, one can see that Congdon was a master. He created a surface that was at once pictorial and materially self-reflexive, simultaneously flat and dimensional. To give you a very contemporary example of seemingly non-objective abstract art, this is a work of my friend and colleague Hannah Mabey. It's called Celestial Anomaly, and she also paints large-scale abstracts like Pollock. So for this, she combined abstracted Baroque imagery from cathedral ceilings and images of the galaxy to create a multi-stable sensory experience. So let's move on to the new forms category. New forms is a sort of umbrella term for a category of highly abstract, conceptually driven art. It includes immersive installations, such as these by Yayoi Kusama, and that is actually Yayoi here in the red unitard. Conceptual art, performance art, and new media. Sorry, I think I hit something. So here, we are looking at 3 photos from a work titled Excellences and Perfections. In 2014, young artist Amalia Ullman began posting a series of photos, almost all selfies, on Instagram. For the almost 5 months, she constructed an ostensibly sincere narrative, and which in the end it wasn't. But through images, she told a 3-part story in which a young woman moves to a city, breaks up with her boyfriend, becomes an escort, has a breakdown, goes to rehab, and then emerges from rehab a health-conscious, yoga-practicing woman. The work is a study in culturally prescribed female performativity. And while the media is new, we don't have to look far for precedents. Throughout time, women have made performative self-portraits, such as these by Artemisia Gentileschi and Cindy Sherman. So Ullman's work highlights issues of our time, which is why I think it's particularly notable. Many issues that I don't have time to go into here. But I think one of the biggest ones is what is real in the age of social media? So now, the juicy stuff. Okay, art that shocks and sometimes offends. Tends to be figurative, but it doesn't have to be. Examples here are Andre Serrano's Piss Christ, and then at the top right, there's a scene from the opening ceremonies of the Olympics this past summer in Paris, and then at the bottom, a painting by Dana Schutz called Open Casket. So let's look at the Piss Christ for a minute. The Piss Christ is a photograph, originally from 1987, of a crucifix supposedly immersed in urine. It has become a metonym for objectionable contemporary art. While the Piss Christ can seem so shocking that it has no precedent, that is not the case. Art history is full of works that shocked and offended the public of their time, such as Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which we revere now, because with our 21st century eyes, we don't see it the same way. In 1546, the public was so scandalized by the nude figures that artisans were hired to paint fig leaves on the figures' bodies. But over time, viewers have come to appreciate what Michelangelo already knew, which was that the human body is a gift, wonderful because it was made by God, and aptly portrayed here because at the final judgment, when our souls and bodies are reunited, presumably they will not have stylish clothing or fig leaves. These, which were actually mentioned in a presentation yesterday, are a couple of Goya's black paintings. And if you don't know Francisco Goya, look him up. He is one of the most powerful painters in art history. These paintings were meditations, and they were, from 1819 or 1818 to 1823. These were meditations on war, sin, terror, and death. They invite viewers into meditations on the darker corners of the human psyche and the evil that each person is capable of. They are so powerful that even today, at the Prado where they reside, some viewers still cannot look at them. These are, we saw these earlier, Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades are still upsetting people. He made them in the early 20th century, and he appropriated common objects to assert that artwork need not be a special, revered object. It can be pedestrian, and artists are actually regular people. So it's actually quite a democratic statement. Later in the 20th century, Robert Rauschenberg famously erased a drawing of Willem de Kooning, who we saw some of his work before, and displayed it And similar to Duchamp, Rauschenberg's objective was to stretch the idea of what an artwork could be. He wanted to create, in this case, a work that depended on the erasure of marks rather than the accumulation of them. So when word spread of what he had done was the de Kooning drawing, artists and non-artists alike were outraged. So back to the Piss Christ. But now we return to the Piss Christ, bringing to bear the scandalous and the grotesque content of the Last Judgment and the black paintings, along with the formal objectives of the ready-mades and the erased de Kooning. But still, how does a person thoughtfully engage a work that offends? The answer is returning to openness, contemplation in front of the work, and empathy. First, one must open oneself enough to ask if the work has value to bestow. As the Romans received their cultural gifts, one can look to cultural context for the gifts the work in question has to give. And I often go to the artist as a starting point for this. In this case, Andre Serrano was a Catholic, Hispanic, gay man living in New York in the 1980s. He was grappling with existential issues such as his sexuality, the AIDS crisis, and the religious culture he came from. So I think learning that, one can ask, is this a work of insult, or is it a cry for help from someone who feels abandoned? And that is not to say that one cannot judge the quality or the morality of a work, but empathy must precede judgment. And I just want to give a quick plug here for Sister Wendy's interview with Bill Moyers, which I put a link on the handout to. It is brilliant. So I suggest for further understanding of this, I really recommend watching that. Real art makes demands. Duchamp wrote that one could be forgiven for not immediately comprehending an abstract painting. However, he wrote a book. To dig into what these paintings were about and believed there was value presented in the mystery. Here at Notre Dame in 1957, Flannery O'Connor gave a talk and said, "The artist presents mystery through manners and grace through nature, but when he finishes, there always has to be left over, that sense of mystery which cannot be accounted for by any human formula." And I want to get to my very last slide, so I'm going to quickly go through. These are, this is a new commission for the opening of the Rachlin Murphy Museum by Julie Meritou. This is a 1978 sculpture that is not new to the museum, but I think is a really good sculpture to experience in person. Oh, and there we go with the video that Max took. Thanks, Max. This is the new chapel, which I highly recommend visiting on the second floor of the museum. And so I hope this presentation has given you a path with the hows and the whys to encounter contemporary art. And in fact, I hope you want to run to the Rachlin Murphy Museum right after our next speaker to experience their works. They have a great contemporary collection. So by searching for the traits of secondarity, one can contextualize and find an entry point to artwork. And I just want to close with a story of our dear deceased brilliant friend, David Schindler, who once told my husband and me this story. It's a self-deprecating story, but it shows both David's ability to laugh at himself and his unbridled joy in phenomenological discussion. So David was acquainted with William Congdon. And when David was teaching here at Notre Dame in the 1980s, he was with a group of students studying abroad in Italy, and he took them to Congdon's studio. And Congdon was showing the students the view out the window that he painted many times, and asked them, "Why is it that I can look out this window every morning and it's new again?" And David piped up and said, "Because of the infinity of being." And Congdon looked at him like, "Not you, I was asking them." And then turned to the students and said, "Yes, because of the infinity of being." And so I'm ever grateful to David for sharing that story, because Congdon's understanding of how being as gift could inform his painting has helped me understand my own. Through openness, contemplation, and empathy, one can find engagement that, in Gisant's words, can be indefinitely pursued without ever exhausting the object in question. The fruit of these endeavors is transcendence, connection, and a deeper, more meaningful peace among us.
Thank you so much, Laurel. We don't unfortunately have time for questions, but I'm sure all the speakers will be. If you aren't actively on your way to Racklin Murphy, I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to you after the session. Our final panelist in this session this morning is Greg Beabout, who is a professor of philosophy at St. Louis University and the Romano Guardini Chair of Catholic Thought and Culture. He teaches and does research in ethics, Kierkegaard, personalism, and Catholic social thought. His recent books include Ethics, The Art of Character, Virtue Ethics in Business and Management, The Character of the Manager, From Office Executive to Wise Steward, Freedom and Its Minuses, and a celebration of the thought of John Paul II. His current research project is tentatively titled Intently Behold the Birds, and I think somewhat related to that theme, his talk today is entitled Nature Writing and the Catholic Imagination, A Story of the Whooping Crane. So let's welcome Greg.
One, it's great to be here too. I'm looking at Matthew. When Matthew was my student like 25 years ago, he's on the faculty. He teaches here at Notre Dame. But when he was at St. Louis University as an undergraduate, I would take the philosophy club. We'd go stargazing together. I'm thinking of Dwight's talk, and we would go bird watching, right? And but now when I take the students bird watching, and they thought I was strange then, but now when I go bird watching, I watch one bird. Like because with internet technology, I mean, here's how much things have changed. There are birds that live near St. Louis now that have not been there for more than 100 years. They've made great comebacks. And some of these birds have tracking devices on them, so I can go online to find out exactly where they are. And I go bird watching to watch one bird, and I want to tell you the story of one of these birds. For all that's wonderful in the humble genre of Catholic nature writing, there are more lands to be explored, more animals to behold, more wisdom to be retrieved. Too little has been done by contemporary naturalists and conservationists to draw from the Catholic literary imagination. Jesus continues to invite his disciples, intently behold the birds. More is needed from writers in this genre to call attention to the flattened way most secular contemporary nature writers unwittingly presume that non-human animals behave as modern liberal individualists. Alistair McIntyre has urged us to recall forgotten wisdom in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and to see this in non-human animals. In response, I want to tell you the story of the life of a whooping crane, Corky of Kaskaskia. One of my aims in telling Corky's story is to help us marvel at Corky's beauty, not only the beauty of Corky's bodily parts, but even more by considering his activities, his traits, and his life as a whole. He hatched of noble lineage. Emerging from an egg the size of an avocado, the young whooping crane grew quickly. The staff at the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, had been keeping an eye on this egg since before Mother's Day, the second Sunday of May in 2015. The researchers overseeing the whooping crane Eastern Partnership project assigned this crane a scientific name, WCEP 6315, right? He was the third in his group of 8 to hatch. The interns gave each a nickname to honor a Wisconsin lake. The first 2 that hatched, 61 and 62, were named Mendota and Flambeau. 63 stood out from the others. He was livelier, full of bubbly energy, fun to be around, buoyant, yet a bit assertive with a willingness to show his dominance, even with his larger elders. The interns chose to name him Corky, in part to capture his personality, in part to honor Corky Lake, which is in far northern Wisconsin, where legend says Paul Bunyan used his giant axe to take down cork pines. Now, most people never get an opportunity to see a whooping crane in person. Your best chance of seeing one is to visit the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, where several captive whooping cranes are on display. Seeing a whooping crane in the wild definitely will get your attention. These are the tallest birds native to North America and the rarest of all the cranes. They stand 5 feet tall or more with a massive wingspan. If, like me, you're able to observe over extended periods of time the practices of a crane and the relationships the crane forms with others of his kind in the habitats where he lives, I think you'd be filled with a sense of wonder and awe. In the 1940s, the population of whooping cranes fell to 15 birds, with only 3 breeding pairs. The species has made a significant comeback due to habitat restoration, changed hunting laws, and domestic breeding programs. The population of whooping cranes has been slowly growing for decades, but there's still less than 1,000 such birds on the earth, and only around 600 in the wild. Whoopers often migrate with sandhill cranes, which outnumber them by more than 1,000 times. Now, a photograph can capture something of the whooping crane's shimmering beauty. Their bright, snowy white feathers, the crimson cap, the long legs and crane neck, the black wingtips so evident in flight, their yellow eyes, the pinkish hue at the base of the bill. But a different sort of beauty shows itself by attending not only to the physical features visible in a photograph, but to the features revealed in their practices, in their traits, and in the story of their crane lives. The only remaining natural flock of whooping cranes migrate from the Gulf Coast of Texas to northern Canada. In 2001, an experimental eastern migratory flock was introduced. Operation Migration, as it was called, used ultralight airplanes to teach whooping cranes to migrate from Wisconsin to Florida. Now, in some ways, Operation Migration was successful. Over a span of 15 years, group after group of young whooping cranes were taught a migration route that had not been used by these types of birds by more than 100 years. The whooping cranes that participated in Operation Migration did not develop full mastery in some of the practices integral to the life of a crane. Many struggled with the practices of making and sustaining a crane family and making and sustaining a community of cranes. Corky and those in his group were raised with the plan that they would be the first group of whooping cranes to be released into the wild after the last flight of Operation Migration in 2015. The plan was to release Corky and his cohort into the wild in the hopes that they would follow other cranes familiar with the migration route, so that Corky and his cohort could learn from older cranes the practices needed to live good crane lives. In the wild, whoopers are raised by doting crane parents. Together, mother and father cranes share the responsibilities of parenting, building a shared place for the mother to lay the eggs, nesting, caring for the little ones, providing food and water and comfort, and teaching the quickly growing colts how and where to find food. Making and sustaining a crane family is a complex social practice, and to become good at it, cranes develop the traits of attentive, gentle, persistent, resilient, and patient parents. Male cranes assist in incubating the eggs and tending the young, but the primary role of the male is to maintain the integrity of the family's territory. After hatching, a mother crane constantly comforts her colts, tucking them under her wings for a nap or nuzzling them beak to beak. The parent cranes stay earthbound through the summer until autumn, when the colts are ready to fly. Before building a nest, cranes of all types are careful in choosing a life mate. Cranes go through a long and patient courtship, usually lasting 2 years or more. Cranes participate in a distinctive form of unison calling. Once the bond is formed, the cranes are highly monogamous. They mate for life. Like many birds, they dance during mating season, but pairs also dance together year-round, which strengthens pair bonding. Let's learn some of the crane dance steps. They're very complex dances. Actually, they do curtsies, the high step, the jump, the tuck bob, a little minuet, a tout-jeté, the object toss, their wing spread, their bow. Crane couples participate in complex improvisational dances, which they get better at through practice. They teach their young through imitation to dance and bow and spread their wings. Corky was raised in captivity without crane parents, by humans wearing costumes and hand-worn puppet heads, designed actually by the daughter of Jim Henson from the Muppets. It's true. For decades of raising such birds in captivity, researchers had learned that cranes imprint on the first animal they see after they hatch. Many cranes raised in captivity will treat humans as their mothers. Years later, when these cranes become sexually mature, they show no interest in reproducing with others of their own kind. They're interested sexually in humans. Researchers have learned to overcome this problem by covering their human bodies with white sheets and teaching the young to eat by imitating a crane puppet. In the first weeks of his life, Corky's fluffy down feathers were cinnamon brown. In sunlight, his plumage was a reddish golden amber. He moved with a joyful energy during his exercise routines, hopping and running and beginning to open his wings as the muscles he would need for the autumn migration developed. In 12 weeks, he grew from the size of an egg to a full 5 feet. The interns who'd been assigned the duty of caring for him approached their task with anticipation, like a young mother cuddling a babe at her breast, full of hope. They dreamed of a glorious life for this tiny hatchling. Some had secret aspirations for him, that he might form a family and reintroduce his kind to a Wisconsin marsh where no whooping crane family had reproduced for more than a century. Perhaps Aldo Leopold, the Wisconsin naturalist and writer, had been premature in penning an elegy for the Wisconsin crane marsh, or so they dreamed. Leopold had lamented that the mysterious wetland bogs of Wisconsin had become haunted by silence, sad and adrift in history. Quote, "A sense of time lies thick and heavy on such a place. Yearly since the Ice Age, it has wakened each spring to the clangor of cranes." The staff and interns who devoted themselves to the responsibilities that come with being attentive and caring foster parents dreamed that the tiny life in this egg might grow and flourish to become the first of his kind to raise a family in the crane marsh where he would be released in the wild. At this point, I want to do a little literary experiment, so some patience with me. If you can imagine, this is a sort of postmodern literary experiment. I'll call on your imagination to think of an ancient Greek stage with the chorus coming out from the east, marching across the stage to the west, and pausing to recite this first group. Imagine some interns, right, tasked with raising captive cranes. A dawn wind stirs on the great aviary warehouse of crane condominiums. When calls a bank of fog with imperceptible slowness, veiling forgotten sunlight, rising now, fairer than all the former days, to shine on Baraboo's light-hearted tribe, the birds unaware of the coiling, well-woven nets. And then the second chorus, a group of teenagers who've been educated in the classical curriculum. Oh, mourn for those with no memory of learned ways of cranecraft, seeking shelter to ward off frost's inhospitable cold, and the sharpness of storms lancing shafts and all that threatens. Only grave death admits no escape. Disease and suffering torment the darkness of crane catharsis. And then the two groups merging together and approaching the audience in unison. We, the industrious eaters of bread, the wretched of soul, the weary worriers deprived of this world's wisdom, sensing only dim glory foretasted, seek in the regal rarity of dancers that whoop, hoop, hoop, hoop in unison, a glimpse through tragic sorrow, shimmering eternity, now here, not wasted. I think my time might run short soon, but let me tell you quickly the story of his life. In the fall, he was transported from Baraboo to Horicon Marsh, about 75 miles east of Baraboo, north and west of Milwaukee. The 8 of them were released, right, banded in October, right? The intern said, since hatching, Corky's been eager to assert his dominance over all the younger chicks, right? He even had the guts to go up against his elders, competing for the best roosting spots. Here he is with Mendota, that's Corky, eating the corn. They thought that he would pair up with one of the older whooping cranes, 1811, but it didn't happen. One of the group of 8 left with a group of sandhill cranes, and then another, but there were 5 left, and they stayed almost till Christmas. And then finally, right, December 21st, they flew in a day. They made it down near Rockford, Illinois, where they stayed for 2 weeks, and then they flew from there down to St. Louis in a day, and they spent the day there. Now, when some 5-foot birds show up, the birding community, word travels fast, and so there had not been whooping cranes around there for a long time, and so all of a sudden everybody's getting to go and see these things. So they spent the winter down by me in St. Louis. Here they are. The place that they chose to stay is called Kaskaskia Island. Really the only major building on this island is Immaculate Conception Mission Church. It's a mission that was established in 1675 by Jacques Marquette. Everyone knows that name. So Kaskaskia Island has its own long and complex history. It was the first capital of the state of Illinois. In 1818, it was a much larger city than St. Louis, but over time and flooding, the population went down. Now the population of Kaskaskia is 14, although the church still exists. And so I've visited Kaskaskia Island many times to see these birds, but that spring, when they returned, they got confused and ended up in Michigan. So they were then transported, they were captured and returned back to Horicon. So all was fine, except 2 weeks later, they decided to fly back to Kaskaskia. And one of them tragically hit its wing in an electric power line and ultimately died. But there were 3 of them that spent that summer, all of the next winter, and then they returned the following spring to Horicon. The next part of the story, we go to Maryland, to Patuxent Research Refuge, where they raised this crane, 3817, a female. And then in the fall, they released her with the hopes that she would pair up with some whooping cranes. But that's not what happened. She made friends with this sandhill crane. Unfortunately, the sandhill crane had a broken wing. You might be able to see it in the photograph there. And so that crane never migrated. They were able to capture that crane and actually fix its wing. But 3817 was elusive, and she ended up spending the whole winter. Wisconsin winter is pretty cold. First crane ever that they know that spent the entire winter in Wisconsin. But the following spring, she and Corky became friends, right? So they had a 2-year-long courtship. And then in May of 2020, all of us remember where we were in May of 2020, right? But they paired, and then they successfully raised the first young one, right? Their nest, their little guy, 1320, right, grew rapidly, right, by fall, right? And now here they are teaching him the ways of the crane, right? And here they are back down by me, right? That late fall, November. This is about a mile from that church that I just showed you before. I've seen them dance like this many times, right? And then they returned the following spring. In 2021, they nested again, but there was the eggs and the little ones are subject to predation. They lay 2 eggs a year, so they lost theirs that year. 2022, the same year. 2023, they nested successfully and raised a little one, but 4 weeks into its life, it was subject to predation, and it died. The little one that they had raised, 1320, he paired and went through a courtship phase, and then so in 2023, he successfully mated with, and they raised a little one, but that little one tragically died, and then 1320 ultimately died that summer as well. Here they are in the fall of that year. Right, they returned then to my area in St. Louis. So my interest in them has been to understand their practices, and began focusing on these courtship practices, dancing practices, unison calling, nest building, right? But the more, partly I'm a philosopher, so I'm reading Aristotle as I'm studying them, and he focuses on the practice of making and sustaining a family and the practice of making and sustaining a community, in his language, a polis. But these birds never succeeded in that. They never had a polis. They never formed a community. I last saw Corky February 4th of this year. They don't like people being around, so he was half a mile away from me, but I watched him for a long time, and then it turned out a week later he died. I don't know the cause of death, but we're left with a series of questions. I think I'm over time, though, so I'll end my story here, and thanks for listening to my story. Thanks.
right at time. Those who wish can talk to any representative